Critical thinking is the ability to interpret, evaluate, and analyze facts and information that are available, to form a judgment or decide if something is right or wrong. More than just being curious about the world around you, critical thinkers make connections between logical ideas to see the bigger picture. Building your critical thinking skills means being able to advocate your ideas and opinions, present them in a logical fashion, and make decisions for improvement. Critical thinking is the process of analyzing available facts, evidence, observations, and arguments to make sound conclusions or informed choices. It involves recognizing underlying assumptions, providing justifications for ideas and actions, evaluating these justifications through comparisons with varying perspectives, and assessing their rationality and potential consequences. The goal of critical thinking is to form a judgment through the application of rational, skeptical, and unbiased analyses and evaluation. In modern times, the use of the phrase critical thinking can be traced to John Dewey, who used the phrase reflective thinking, which depends on the knowledge base of an individual. The excellence of critical thinking in which an individual can engage varies according to it. According to philosopher Richard W. Paul, critical thinking and analysis are competencies that can be learned or trained. The application of critical thinking includes self-directed, self-disciplined, self-monitored, and self-corrective habits of the mind. As critical thinking is not a natural process, it must be induced, and ownership of the process must be taken for successful questioning and reasoning. Critical thinking presupposes a rigorous commitment to overcome egocentrism and sociocentrism, that leads to a mindful command of effective communication and problem solving. In the classical period, 5th c. 4th BC, of ancient Greece, the philosopher Plato, 428 to 347 BC, indicated that the teachings of Socrates, 470 to 399 BC, are the earliest records of what today is called critical thinking. In an early dialogue by Plato, the philosopher Socrates debates several speakers about the ethical matter of the rightness or wrongness of Socrates escaping from prison. Upon consideration, Plato concluded that to escape prison would violate everything he believes to be greater than himself, the laws of Athens and the guiding voice that Socrates claims to hear. Socrates established the unreliability of authority and of authority figures to possess knowledge and consequent insight, that for an individual man or woman to lead a good life that is worth living, that person must ask critical questions and possess an interrogative soul, which seeks evidence and then closely examines the available facts, and then follows the implications of the statement under analysis, thereby tracing the implications of thought and action. As a form of cooperative argumentation, Socratic questioning requires the comparative judgment of facts, which answers then would reveal the person's irrational thinking and lack of verifiable knowledge. Socrates also demonstrated that authority does not ensure accurate, verifiable knowledge. Thus, Socratic questioning analyses beliefs, assumptions, and presumptions, by relying upon evidence and a sound rationale. In modern times, the phrase critical thinking was coined by pragmatist philosopher John Dewey in his book How We Think. As a type of intellectualism, the development of critical thinking is a means of critical analysis that applies rationality to develop a critique of the subject matter. According to the Foundation for Critical Thinking, in 1987 the U.S. National Council for Excellence in Critical Thinking defined critical thinking as the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, or evaluating information gathered from, or generated by, observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication, as a guide to belief and action. Traditionally, critical thinking has been variously defined as follows. The intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and/or evaluating information gathered from, or generated by, observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication, as a guide to belief and action. Disciplined thinking that is clear, rational, open-minded, and informed by evidence. Purposeful, self-regulatory judgment which results in interpretation, analysis, evaluation, and inference, as well as explanation of the evidential, conceptual, methodological, criteriological, or contextual considerations upon which that judgment is based. Includes a commitment to using reason in the formulation of our beliefs. The skill and propensity to engage in an activity with reflective skepticism, McPeck, 1981. Thinking about one's thinking in a manner designed to organize and clarify, raise the efficiency of, and recognize errors and biases in one's own thinking. Critical thinking is not hard thinking, nor is it directed at solving problems, other than improving one's own thinking. Critical thinking is inward directed with the intent of maximizing the rationality of the thinker. One does not use critical thinking to solve problems, one uses critical thinking to improve one's process of thinking. An appraisal based on careful analytical evaluation. Critical thinking is a type of thinking pattern that requires people to be reflective, and pay attention to decision-making which guides their beliefs and actions. Critical thinking allows people to deduct with more logic, to process sophisticated information and look at various sides of an issue so they can produce more solid conclusions. Critical thinking has 7 critical features: being inquisitive and curious, being open-minded to different sides, being able to think systematically, being analytical, being persistent to truth, being confident about critical thinking itself, and lastly, being mature. Although critical thinking could be defined in several different ways, there is a general agreement in its key component, the desire to reach for a satisfactory result, and this should be achieved by rational thinking and result-driven manner. Halpern thinks that critical thinking firstly involves learned abilities such as problem-solving, calculation and successful probability application. It also includes a tendency to engage the thinking process. In recent times, Stanovich believed that modern IQ testing could hardly measure the ability of critical thinking. Critical thinking is essentially a questioning, challenging approach to knowledge and perceived wisdom. It involves ideas and information from an objective position and then questioning this information in the light of our own values, attitudes, and personal philosophy. Contemporary critical thinking scholars have expanded these traditional definitions to include qualities, concepts, and processes such as creativity, imagination, discovery, reflection, empathy, connecting knowing, feminist theory, subjectivity, ambiguity, and inconclusiveness. Some definitions of critical thinking exclude these subjective practices. According to Ennis, critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and/or evaluating information gathered from, or generated by, observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication, as a guide to belief and action. This definition Ennis provided is highly agreed by Harvey Siegel, Peter Faciani, and Deanna Kuhn. According to Ennis' definition, critical thinking requires a lot of attention and brain function. When a critical thinking approach is applied to education, it helps the student's brain function better and understand texts differently. Different fields of study may require different types of critical thinking. Critical thinking provides more angles and perspectives upon the same material. The study of logical argumentation is relevant to the study of critical thinking. Logic is concerned with the analysis of arguments, including the appraisal of their correctness or incorrectness. In the field of epistemology, critical thinking is considered to be logically correct thinking, which allows for differentiation between logically true and logically false statements. In first-wave logical thinking, the thinker is removed from the train of thought, and the analysis of connections between concepts or points in thought is ostensibly free of any bias. In his essay Beyond Logicism in Critical Thinking, Cary S. Walters describes this ideology thus: a logistic approach to critical thinking conveys the message to students that thinking is legitimate only when it conforms to the procedures of informal, and, to a lesser extent, formal, logic, and that the good thinker necessarily aims for styles of examination and appraisal that are analytical, abstract, universal, and objective. This model of thinking has become so entrenched in conventional academic wisdom that many educators accept it as canon. Such principles are concomitant with the increasing dependence on a quantitative understanding of the world. In the second wave of critical thinking, authors consciously moved away from the logocentric mode of critical thinking characteristic of the first wave. Although many scholars began to take a less exclusive view of what constitutes critical thinking, rationality and logic remain widely accepted as essential bases for critical thinking. Walters argues that exclusive logicism in the first wave sense is based on the unwarranted assumption that good thinking is reducible to logical thinking. There are three types of logical reasoning. Informally, two kinds of logical reasoning can be distinguished in addition to formal deduction, which are induction and abduction. Deduction is the conclusion drawn from the structure of an argument's premises, by use of rules of inference, formally those of propositional calculus. For example, X is human and all humans have a face, so X has a face. Induction is drawing a conclusion from a pattern that is guaranteed by the strictness of the structure to which it applies. Abduction is drawing a conclusion using a heuristic that is likely, but not inevitable given some foreknowledge. For example, I observe sheep in a field, and they appear white from my viewing angle, so sheep are white. Contrast with the deductive statement, some sheep are white on at least one side. Critical thinking and rationality. Carrie S. Walters, an emeritus philosophy professor from Gettysburg College, argues that rationality demands more than just logical or traditional methods of problem solving and analysis, or what he calls the calculus of justification, but also considers cognitive acts such as imagination, conceptual creativity, intuition, and insight. These functions are focused on discovery, on more abstract processes instead of linear, rules-based approaches to problem solving. The linear and non-sequential mind must both be engaged in the rational mind. The ability to critically analyze an argument, to dissect structure and components, thesis, and reasons is essential. But so is the ability to be flexible and consider non-traditional alternatives and perspectives. These complementary functions are what allow for critical thinking to be a practice encompassing imagination and intuition in cooperation with traditional modes of deductive inquiry. Functions. The list of core critical thinking skills includes observation, interpretation, analysis, inference, evaluation, explanation, and metacognition. According to Reynolds, 2011, an individual or group engaged in a strong way of critical thinking gives due consideration to establish, for instance, evidence through reality, context skills to isolate the problem from context, relevant criteria for making the judgment well, applicable methods or techniques for forming the judgment, applicable theoretical constructs for understanding the problem and the question at hand. In addition to possessing strong critical thinking skills, one must be disposed to engage problems and decisions using those skills. Critical thinking employs not only logic but broad intellectual criteria such as clarity, credibility, accuracy, precision, relevance, depth, breadth, significance, and fairness. Critical thinking calls for the ability to recognize problems, to find workable means for meeting those problems, understand the importance of prioritization and order of precedence in problem solving, gather and marshal pertinent, relevant, information, recognize unstated assumptions and values, comprehend and use language with accuracy, clarity, and discernment, interpret data, to appraise evidence and evaluate arguments, recognize the existence, or non-existence, of logical relationships between propositions, draw warranted conclusions and generalizations, put to test the conclusions and generalizations at which one arrives, reconstruct one's patterns of beliefs on the basis of wider experience, render accurate judgments about specific things and qualities in everyday life. In sum, a persistent effort to examine any belief or supposed form of knowledge in the light of the evidence that supports or refutes it and the further conclusions to which it tends. Critical thinking is significant in the learning process of internalization, in the construction of basic ideas, principles, and theories inherent in content. And critical thinking is significant in the learning process of application, whereby those ideas, principles, and theories are implemented effectively as they become relevant in learners' lives. In professional fields, Critical thinking is an important element of all professional fields and academic disciplines, by referencing their respective sets of permissible questions, evidence sources, criteria, etc. Within the framework of scientific skepticism, the process of critical thinking involves the careful acquisition and interpretation of information and use of it to reach a well-justified conclusion. The concepts and principles of critical thinking can be applied to any context or case, but only by reflecting upon the nature of that application. Critical thinking forms, therefore, a system of related, and overlapping, modes of thought such as anthropological thinking, sociological thinking, historical thinking, political thinking, psychological thinking, philosophical thinking, mathematical thinking, chemical thinking, biological thinking, ecological thinking, legal thinking, ethical thinking, musical thinking, thinking like a painter, sculptor, nurse, engineer, business person, etc. In other words, though critical thinking principles are universal, their application to disciplines requires a process of reflective contextualization. Psychology offerings, for example, have included courses such as Critical Thinking about the Paranormal, in which students are subjected to a series of cold readings and tested on their belief of the psychic, who is eventually announced to be a fake. In short, critical thinking is considered important for enabling a professional in any field to analyze, evaluate, explain, and restructure thinking, thereby ensuring the act of thinking without false belief. However, even with knowledge of the methods of logical inquiry and reasoning, mistakes occur, and due to a thinker's inability to apply the methodology consistently, and because of overruling character traits such as egocentrism. Critical thinking includes identification of prejudice, bias, propaganda, self-deception, distortion, misinformation, etc. Given research in cognitive psychology, some educators believe that schools should focus on teaching their students critical thinking skills and cultivation of intellectual traits. Habits or traits of the mind. The habits of mind that characterize a person strongly disposed toward critical thinking include a desire to follow reason and evidence wherever they may lead, a systematic approach to problem solving, inquisitiveness, even-handedness, and confidence in reasoning. According to a definition analysis by Kampf and Bond, 2001, critical thinking involves problem solving, decision making, metacognition, rationality, rational thinking, reasoning, knowledge, intelligence, and also a moral component such as reflective thinking. Critical thinkers therefore need to have reached a level of maturity in their development, possess a certain attitude as well as a set of taught skills. There is a postulation by some writers that the tendencies from habits of mind should be thought as virtues to demonstrate the characteristics of a critical thinker. These intellectual virtues are ethical qualities that encourage motivation to think in particular ways towards specific circumstances. However, these virtues have also been criticized by skeptics who argue that the evidence is lacking for a specific mental basis underpinning critical thinking. Teaching critical thinking. John Dewey is one of many educational leaders who recognized that a curriculum aimed at building thinking skills would benefit the individual learner, the community, and democracy. In a 2014 meta-analysis, researchers reviewed 341 quasi or true experimental studies of teaching critical thinking, all of which used some form of standardized critical thinking measure. The authors describe the various methodological approaches and attempt to categorize differing assessment tools, which include standardized tests, and second source measures, tests developed by teachers, tests developed by researchers, and tests developed by teachers who also serve the role as the researcher. The results emphasized the need for exposing students to real-world problems and the importance of encouraging open dialogue within a supportive environment. Effective strategies for teaching critical thinking are thought to be possible in a wide variety of educational settings. One attempt to assess the humanities' role in teaching critical thinking and reducing belief in pseudoscientific claims was made at North Carolina State University. Some success was noted, and the researchers emphasized the value of the humanities in providing the skills to evaluate current events and qualitative data in context. Historically, the teaching of critical thinking focused only on logical procedures such as formal and informal logic. This emphasized to students that good thinking is equivalent to logical thinking. However, a second wave of critical thinking urges educators to value conventional techniques, meanwhile expanding what it means to be a critical thinker. In 1994, Carrie Walters compiled a conglomeration of sources surpassing this logical restriction to include many different authors' research regarding connected knowing, empathy, gender-sensitive ideals, collaboration, worldviews, intellectual autonomy, morality and enlightenment. These concepts invite students to incorporate their own perspectives and experiences into their thinking. Scott Lilienfeld notes that there is some evidence to suggest that basic critical thinking skills might be successfully taught to children at a younger age than previously thought. In the English and Welsh school systems, critical thinking is offered as a subject that 16 to 18-year-olds can take as an A-level. In 1995, a meta-analysis of the literature on teaching effectiveness in higher education noted concerns that higher education was failing to meet society's requirements for well-educated citizens. It concluded that although faculty may aspire to develop students' thinking skills, in practice they have tended to aim at facts and concepts utilizing lowest levels of cognition, rather than developing intellect or values. Critical thinking is also considered important for human rights education for toleration. The Declaration of Principles on Tolerance adopted by UNESCO in 1995 affirms that education for tolerance could aim at countering factors that lead to fear and exclusion of others, and could help young people to develop capacities for independent judgment, critical thinking, and ethical reasoning. Assessment of critical thinking. Under the OCR exam board, students can sit 2 exam papers for the advanced subsidiary, credibility of evidence and assessing and developing argument. The full advanced GCE is now available. In addition to the 2 advanced subsidiary units, candidates sit the 2 papers resolution of dilemmas and critical reasoning. The A-level tests candidates on their ability to think critically about, and analyze, arguments on their deductive or inductive validity, as well as producing their own arguments. It also tests their ability to analyze certain related topics such as credibility and ethical decision-making. However, due to its comparative lack of subject content, many universities do not accept it as a main A-level for admissions. Nevertheless, the advanced subsidiary is often useful in developing reasoning skills, and the full advanced GCE is useful for degree courses in politics, philosophy, history, or theology, providing the skills required for critical analysis that are useful, for example, in biblical study. There used to also be an advanced extension award offered in critical thinking in the UK, open to any A-level student regardless of whether they have the critical thinking A-level. Cambridge International Examinations have an A-level in thinking skills. From 2008, Assessment and Qualifications Alliance has also been offering an A-level critical thinking specification. OCR Exam Board have also modified theirs for 2008. Many examinations for university entrance set by universities, on top of A-level examinations, also include a critical thinking component, such as the LNAT, the UCAT, the biomedical admissions test and the thinking skills assessment. In Qatar, critical thinking was offered by Al Barak, an outreach, non-traditional educational program that targeted high school students and focused on a curriculum based on STEM fields. The idea behind this was to offer high school students the opportunity to connect with the research environment in the Center for Advanced Materials, CAM, at Qatar University. Faculty members train and mentor the students and help develop and enhance their critical thinking, problem solving, and teamwork skills. Research of critical thinking. After undertaking research in schools, Edward M. Glaser proposed in 1941 that the ability to think critically involves 3 elements. An attitude of being disposed to consider in a thoughtful way the problems and subjects that come within the range of one's experiences. Knowledge of the methods of logical inquiry and reasoning. Some skill in applying those methods. The Critical Thinking Project at Human Science Lab, London, is involved in the scientific study of all major educational systems in prevalence today to assess how the systems are working to promote or impede critical thinking. Contemporary cognitive psychology regards human reasoning as a complex process that is both reactive and reflective. This presents a problem that is detailed as a division of a critical mind in juxtaposition to sensory data and memory. The psychological theory disposes of the absolute nature of the rational mind, in reference to conditions, abstract problems and discursive limitations. Where the relationship between critical thinking skills and critical thinking dispositions is an empirical question, the ability to attain causal domination exists, for which Socrates was known to be largely disposed against as the practice of sophistry. Accounting for a measure of critical thinking dispositions is the California Measure of Mental Motivation and the California Critical Thinking Dispositions Inventory. The Critical Thinking Toolkit is an alternative measure that examines student beliefs and attitudes about critical thinking. Online communication. The advent and rising popularity of online courses have prompted some to ask if computer-mediated communication promotes, hinders, or has no effect on the amount and quality of critical thinking in a course, relative to face-to-face communication. There is some evidence to suggest a fourth, more nuanced possibility, that online communication may promote some aspects of critical thinking but hinder others. For example, Giller et al. 2008, found that, relative to face-to-face discourse, online discourse featured more justifications, while face-to-face discourse featured more instances of students expanding on what others had said. The increase in justifications may be due to the asynchronous nature of online discussions, while the increase in expanding comments may be due to the spontaneity of real-time discussion. Newman et al. 1995, showed similar differential effects. They found that while online communications boasted more important statements and linking of ideas, it lacked novelty. The authors suggest that this may be due to difficulties participating in a brainstorming-style activity in an asynchronous environment. Rather, the asynchrony may promote users to put forth considered, thought-out contributions. Researchers assessing critical thinking in online discussion forums often employ a technique called content analysis, where the text of online discourse, or the transcription of face-to-face discourse, is systematically coded for different kinds of statements relating to critical thinking. For example, a statement might be coded as discuss ambiguities to clear them up or welcoming outside knowledge as positive indicators of critical thinking. Conversely, statements reflecting poor critical thinking may be labeled as sticking to prejudice or assumptions or squashing attempts to bring in outside knowledge. The frequency of these codes in online communication and face-to-face discourse can be compared to draw conclusions about the quality of critical thinking. Searching for evidence of critical thinking in discourse has roots in a definition of critical thinking put forth by Kuhn, 1991, which emphasizes the social nature of discussion and knowledge construction. There is limited research on the role of social experience in critical thinking development, but there is some evidence to suggest it is an important factor. For example, research has shown that 3 to 4-year-old children can discern, to some extent, the differential credibility and expertise of individuals. Further evidence for the impact of social experience on the development of critical thinking skills comes from work that found that 6 to 7-year-olds from China have similar levels of skepticism to 10 and 11-year-olds in the United States. If the development of critical thinking skills was solely due to maturation, it is unlikely we would see such dramatic differences across cultures. Critical thinking is useful in many areas of your life, including your career. It makes you a well-rounded individual, one who has looked at all of their options and possible solutions before making a choice. Having critical thinking skills is important because they are universal, crucial for the economy, essential for improving language and presentation skills, very helpful in promoting creativity, important for self-reflection, the basis of science and democracy. Critical thinking skills are used every day in a myriad of ways and can be applied to situations such as a CEO approaching a group project or a nurse deciding in which order to treat their patients. Critical thinking skills differ from individual to individual and are utilized in various ways. Examples of common critical thinking skills include identification of biases. Identifying biases means knowing there are certain people or things that may have an unfair prejudice or influence on the situation at hand. Pointing out these biases helps to remove them from contention when it comes to solving the problem and allows you to see things from a different perspective. Research. Researching details and facts allows you to be prepared when presenting your information to people. You'll know exactly what you're talking about due to the time you've spent with the subject material, and you'll be well spoken and know what questions to ask to gain more knowledge. When researching, always use credible sources and factual information. Open-mindedness. Being open-minded when having a conversation or participating in a group activity is crucial to success. Dismissing someone else's ideas before you've heard them will inhibit you from progressing to a solution, and will often create animosity. If you truly want to solve a problem, you need to be willing to hear everyone's opinions and ideas if you want them to hear yours. Analysis. Analyzing your research will lead to you having a better understanding of the things you've heard and read. As a true critical thinker, you'll want to seek out the truth and get to the source of issues. It's important to avoid taking things at face value and always dig deeper. Problem solving. Problem solving is perhaps the most important skill that critical thinkers can possess. The ability to solve issues and bounce back from conflict is what helps you succeed, be a leader, and affect change. One way to properly solve problems is to first recognize there's a problem that needs solving. By determining the issue at hand, you can then analyze it and come up with several potential solutions. You can develop critical thinking skills every day if you approach problems in a logical manner. Explore a few ways you can start your path to improvement. 1. Ask questions. Be inquisitive about everything. Maintain a neutral perspective and develop a natural curiosity, so you can ask questions that develop your understanding of the situation or task at hand. The more details, facts, and information you have, the better informed you are to make decisions. 2. Practice active listening. Utilize active listening techniques, which are founded in empathy, to really listen to what the other person is saying. Critical thinking, in part, is the cognitive process of reading the situation, the words coming out of their mouth, their body language, their reactions to your own words. Then, you might paraphrase to clarify what they're saying, so both of you agree you're on the same page. 3. Develop your logic skill in critical thinking. This is perhaps a more abstract task that requires practice and long-term development. However, think of a schoolteacher assessing the classroom to determine how to energize the lesson. You have options such as playing a game, watching a video, or challenging the students with a reward system. Using logic, you might decide that the reward system will take up too much time and is not an immediate fix. A video may not be relevant at this time. So, you may decide to play a simple word association game. Scenarios like this happen every day, so next time, you can be more aware of what will work and what won't. Over time, developing your logic and reasoning will strengthen your critical thinking skills. Critical thinking skills are useful in many different situations and can help make great decisions. Thank you for watching this video.